Australia's Labor Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, and RedBridge's Kos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. G'day, Curtinisters. Welcome back to Curtin's Cast, the JCRC's podcast of politics, culture and idea, hosted by myself, Nick Dyrenfurth, head honcho of the JCRC, and my great mate, Kung Fu Kos Samaras, the boss of RedBridge. How are you, Kosy?
Good, man. How are you?
Good. You've got the gloves on today. We're going to be sparring, metaphorically, not literally. I wouldn't want to get in a scrape with you. 30 years ago, the other week, Kos, John, we marked an anniversary in Australian political history. John Howard won government back in 1996, March 1996. I remember this. I may have shed a tear, Kos. I may have shed a tear I wasn't quite 18. I didn't get to vote. He won government with 94 seats and a primary vote above 47%. It was a classic two-party election. Voters sort of neatly into two columns. Swing voters decided everything. They swung savagely against the Keating Labor government. And we know that world is gone. And we're going to deep dive today into your most recent RedBridge accent polling in Victoria, showing both major parties struggling to reach 30%. 30%. Not, the days of primary with a 4 in front of it, long gone. Maybe not gone in South Australia, and we're going to touch on South Australia today with One Nation right in the frame. So this is not a conventional election contest that we are approaching in Victoria in November of this year. We are seeing fragmentation, hyper-fragmentation in real time. And I liked the turn of phrase you used. We're not looking at one election, we're looking at 88 by-elections.
And we perhaps are looking at a conventional election going forward.
Correct. And we're going to deep dive into that. We're going to look ahead to that South Australian election as well. And also, riffing off last week's conversation with Kylie Gilbert-Moore, asked whether international conflicts such as that which is transpiring in the Middle East, how that will shape Australian politics in 2026 and beyond. Kos, your latest AFR RedBridge accent poll, it's a remarkable picture of the Victorian political landscape. Just some of the headline numbers: Coalition 28% primary, Labor 25% primary, One Nation 24%. What's going on?
Really what we're seeing in Victoria is most likely the first example of it in this country that we have been witnessing in the UK, for example. So initially in the UK, the traditional Conservative Party started to lose ground to reform. For a while, Stamer's Labor Party was seen to be holding steady, not having any existential problems with its primary. It won an enormous amount of seats with an incredibly low primary because its opponent collapsed.
Yep.
What we saw in 2022 at the Victorian election was exactly the same, and probably actually also at a federal level. Labor wins because its opponents collapse. The problem with the Labor camp in Victoria is it took all the wrong lessons out of that win in 2022. It banked it as if it was an endorsement of their approach, which was to continue governing in a way that you rewarded middle-class, well-serviced parts of Melbourne in particular, and you looked at other parts of Melbourne which you historically have occupied from a safe perspective with some secondary consideration. All of that's now coming home to roost because we are entering into a new paradigm where people are looking for alternatives. They feel that democracy is not working for them. And the epicenter of that mentality and the epicenter of this fragmentation is in the state of Victoria.
Who has most to fear out of the results, Kos? Coalition, Labor, or both? It seems like the coalition's collapse, as you pointed out, is the most dramatic.
Yes.
They're down roughly
12
points to 28%. 28%. That's a dramatic fall.
Yeah, I think both of them have got problems for different reasons. But I would still rather be in Jess Wilson's shoes than Labor's shoes at the moment.
Really?
The reason I say that is because, well, you're at 28% and One Nation is at 24%. And of the One Nation vote, the preference flow from One Nation to the coalition is very, very strong. If Labor's primary vote was closer to 30, then you and I will probably be having a very different conversation, and Labor will be well positioned to be returned comfortably, even with such a low primary vote. But that's not the case. So we are seeing an attrition occur on Labor's base. As a researcher and someone who has watched these trends for years, particularly internationally, but also now in this country, I have fears that we have not seen the bottom of Labor's primary vote yet. That is my concern. And as you and I have touched on in previous episodes, I wouldn't necessarily say it is a manifestation or a product of the current leadership. This has been in the making for some time. The policies that were pursued for electoral victory, you can't take it away from the previous administration under Dan Andrews. They had a mission. Their mission was to win elections, and they won that, and they achieved those missions. But there is a price to pay for that strategy, and that strategy was, as I touched on before, focused on a particular part of Melbourne, not all of Melbourne and all of Victoria. And so, can Labor get to 45 seats right now? No. Can the coalition get to 45 seats right now? No. Who can get closer? Right now, I'd put my money on the coalition, but that's a big if, right? So we are very much in uncharted territory.
They need 16 additional seats. Is that right, Kos?
That's right. And you're not getting that with 28% primary. So you're going to rely on One Nation picking up seats, but unfortunately for you being the coalition, they're going to pick seats up off you more than Labor. Would not rule out One Nation winning seats off Labor either, in particular parts of Melbourne. So, you want to think about...
Out of Metro, yeah?
Yeah, so look, Labor's primary vote's really healthy in the inner parts and middle parts of Melbourne. Where the professional class lives, I would say in a contest versus the Liberal Party, they are well positioned because One Nation will contest every single seat. It will eat into the Liberal Party's base in middle suburbia, inner suburbia, and it will have very little impact on Labor's base. So what we'll see there is a repeat of 2022, where the Liberal Party loses further to its right flank and Labor capitalises on that attrition because its primary vote's largely not going to move, or it's going to move a little bit in the negative, but still be enough for it to win these seats like Bethany, Mordialloc, and even seats like Box Hill and so on. All these middle urban electorates should be okay for the Labor camp. Where it gets into serious trouble is in the outer suburbs. And the number of seats here right now are extensive. Now, we don't know what those contests look like. We know that, for example, in a normal world, the Liberal Party should win a seat like Hastings and Pakenham and Bass. But right now, with One Nation in the mix, does One Nation win Hastings? Does One Nation split the Liberal vote so badly that Labor's able to hold on to one of those outer eastern seats? We don't know that yet. In Melbourne's west, same paradigm applies. In Melton, does the One Nation standing split the Liberal base and Labor's able to capitalise on that, or does One Nation not only split the Liberal base but splits the Labor base and runs first and the Liberal preference is elected? And does that trend repeat itself in other seats like Greenvale, Coleroyd and Sydenham, with these electorates which have got second, third generation migrants, and through our research we have identified as having an inclination to vote for One Nation. So that's the picture. It's complex. It's still in flux. We have 8 months to go. It could change, but yeah.
You sort of surmised this dynamic very nicely. Effectively 88 by-elections happening at once. Come late November. That's going to make polling and predicting an outcome extraordinarily difficult. You're going to be earning your money this year, Kos.
Yeah. Well, look, this is why statewide polls in this environment are cute. They're nice, but I'm not a really big fan of people or the media, parts of the media, reporting them as if they are an accurate diagnostic tool for what is going to happen in November. When you're dealing with such a fractured political environment, you're going to have to be really careful about what those numbers tell you. Your samples have to be very, very big for you then to at least have some understanding at a granular level as to where everything sits. Since you and I just touched on the differences across Melbourne, the differences across Victoria and regional Victoria, they matter. It could be the difference between Labor ended up on 38 seats and Coalition on 33 and One Nation winning 3, Greens 3, and Labor's able to cobble together a broad progressive coalition. We don't know. You can have a situation where Labor ends up on a 48% two-party preferred and still wins in this crazy environment because, of course, that 52% two-party preferred vote for the coalition is all in the wrong places.
Yep.
Right? So if your primary vote is so low, if it's in the wrong places, you will lose that election.
It's going to be extraordinarily complex because you talked about the progressive coalition, which I would. My view is, that's how it's part of the reason we've got it, that Labor's getting itself into this problem. I mean, we're seeing sort of things happen rapidly with One Nation, but this is actually the result of a decades-long process. Thomas Piketty's talked about the development of a Brahmin left as opposed to the merchant right. And that comes through really clearly in that social coalition which RedBridge Accent has mapped. Looking at the coalition of the Labor vote, renters swing behind Labor 61% on a 2PP basis, whatever that means, given it's a 3-horse race. University graduates, 55%. Swinging behind Labor. Then when we get to no year 12 educational attainment, it drops dramatically to 41%. Homeowners as well, 41%.
Yeah, caveat with that. So what we know through extensive research is that anyone who reports to us as having less than year 12, they're usually baby boomers because that's usually the generation that did not finish high school or college, secondary college in these days. What the numbers do tell us, but going to your point, is yes, the Labor camp is doing really well amongst the middle class, university educated constituencies. It is struggling amongst individuals who have an ABN. It's struggling amongst individuals who have got a TAFE qualification, who work with their hands, who work by standing on their feet. It's now also struggling amongst diverse Victorians as well, who again are working in these precarious, low-paid environments. These are the constituencies that used to be their base. And I'm not talking about, your usual, blue-collar constituency. I'm talking about this diverse collar constituency that is of a working class background. This group is what's causing Labor the problems in the polling. And it's not necessarily coalescing around the coalition. It is fragmenting in all sorts of places. It's going into independents, going to other parties, going to the Greens, even in the outer suburbs. It's getting a little bit of it's going to One Nation.
Well, there's a dramatic statistic, Kosy, from your polling about the erosion in Labor's working class vote, which seems to underline the point that education is is coalescing with class to become the most serious vote predictor. TAFE and trade workers, historically Labor's core constituency, with the caveats around boomers, they're now sitting at 45% for Labor. And that's according to your poll, One Nation is pulling 30% of their first preferences. That's right.
Yeah, this is the constituency that some of us were pontificating about 6 months ago could potentially put Labor into a really serious situation in Victoria. And I think that is now emerging as definitely a reality. The point you make there, Nick, about education, it's actually a national trend.
It's an international trend.
That's correct, of course. The one thing we know about the One Nation vote and those who don't vote for One Nation, the first red flag would be, do you have a university degree? If you do, the likelihood of you One Nation is remote. And so that is the first point I think we all need to make, and that is that even in the state of Victoria, electorates where there are high numbers of people with a university degree, Labor's going to do pretty well. So hence I mentioned Bentley and Mordiartic and all those electorates. They've got high numbers of those individuals, and they outnumber everyone else. And if you're on the Conservative side of politics, even if you're the Liberal Party, you're going to struggle.
This is a reversal of the class education divide really up until sort of 90, up until the 1990s, early 2000s. And this began building in the 1970s with the opening up of the university tertiary education sector. But, it flipped. Previously, if you had acquired a degree, you were more likely to vote for the centre right of politics. I think people, there's a lack of historical memory.
Yep.
It's not just amongst the general population; it's amongst the political class, and even the knowledge class who are becoming the most important part of Labor's electoral coalition. This wasn't the way that things used to work. Now there would be some people, cause inside Labor Party, who sort of shrug their shoulders and go, "So what?" It's all about who can form the next government.
Yeah, that's
But
true.
then the question that you and I would pose, and there are others who hold this view, is, well, if Labor's relying on the tertiary educated and often higher income Victorians and Australians, well, what's the point of a Labor Party if it's not representing working class people, if it's not representing the poor and the disadvantaged?
It's a poor electoral strategy, and I'll walk you through that quickly. During the 90s and early 2000s, Labor nationally, but also in Victoria, started to lose what was then known as its traditional working class base. Largely monocultural, working with their hands. They've now largely have, for the last 15 odd years, been voting Liberal and other minor parties, and now in a very significant number for One Nation. They've not been on Labor's pile for some time, but Labor in particularly Melbourne and Sydney was able to replace that constituency with the new emerging working class, which is the migrant working class constituency. Yep. That's still present, and is still present in Victoria as well. So you could be safe in saying that even now, with a 25% primary vote, Labor will secure the vast majority of Chinese and Indian Australians who are enrolled to vote in Victoria. Sure, that's not enough, because what's happening also within these constituencies is they also are fragmenting and breaking into minor parties. And we've seen that writ large at the last state election in 2022 in Melbourne's outer northwestern suburbs, where there was significant hemorrhaging of the Labor primary within the very communities which were replacing that working class constituency. So the numbers game, it doesn't stack up. If you're losing your replacement cohort, which I've articulated in a Substack article that I published on the weekend, if you're losing that group that you've banked as a way of allowing you to pivot into the educated classes, and you've banked it in a way that you've ignored these people and their economic needs, and there'll be people within the Labor government that will say, no, we haven't ignored it. Well, if I break down the infrastructure spending by postcode, I don't think you need to be a genius to work out what's happened in Victoria and where the money's gone, right? You don't have enough on the table to form government with just the university educated constituency. That's not enough. You need that other replacement cohort. You need it in Melbourne, you need it in Sydney, and you need it increasingly in Brisbane and Perth as well. So this group cannot be ignored. And in Victoria, it has. And we're seeing it now writ large in the polling numbers.
Yes, because I can tell you, I'll give you a little inside tip, the inside running in the background of the JCRC. We're doing some work into unemployment by seats federally and Victorian wise, because that hasn't been done since I think the 2022 census. So that'll tell an interesting story as well. Very interesting story, Kos. So tell us a little bit more about the generational divide. I mean, that sits really within the story you're telling about the resorting around class and education. We've got Gen Z. I love Gen Z because they're giving Labor 64% of the two-party preferred, but coming to your point, boomers, it just collapses, comes down to 38%. So that, again, would seem to encapsulate that resorting around education.
Yeah, and so in this generation divide, there is still hope for Labor to be re-elected to its historic fourth term.
Yep.
Because even amongst millennials, Labor's still winning convincingly. So I know there's been some commentators that saying, part of the millennial base has gone to One Nation. Yeah, sure, they will mostly form Liberal voters, right? very significant chunks of anything under the age of 50 is still very good for Labor. So if they're able to hold down that coalition, recoup those losses that they've experienced over the last 6 months, get their primary closer to 30, they'll have a good day. And they'll have a good day because they still have a foundation. The foundation is, yes, that university cohort, but younger Victorians as well. And yes, they've been losing ground amongst this migrant constituency, this replacement cohort I've been talking about. But again, it is not hard to bring them back. So you can bring them back through a campaign. You're going to have to work pretty hard at it because you're going to have to convince this constituency that what you've done in the last 6-7 years was a bit of a mistake, and that you've learnt your ways, and you're going to refocus your attention to them. I must say, they have this group that we're talking about have small levels of confidence that the other side of politics is any way, shape or form interested in them at all.
Yeah, I want to ask about that and the influence of One Nation. Your polling suggests that Labor is actually performing better amongst so-called soft voters. I want to explain who these so-called soft voters are, Kos. And I'd like you, just before we move on to South Australia, the Crow Eaters, we've seen the rise of tactical voting, Kos. And we've seen that in Australia,
yes,
with Teals and others. And we saw that with millennials, particularly older millennials, going to Labor over the Greens at the last federal election. We've seen tactical voting becoming a big thing in the UK. We saw it in the most recent by-election there as well, where the Greens won Labor's, I think it's 24th most safest seat. What role will these so-called soft voters play? What role will tactical voters play, particularly with the spectre of One Nation, and thinking about, potential Liberal voters? There seems to be a lot less of them these days, but how will that dynamic play out as well?
There is a portion of the Liberal base that even in our research will preference Labor over One Nation. And when giving a choice, they will prefer a Labor MP to a One Nation MP. So in some contests around Melbourne, come November this year, if One Nation is in the last two, and it's a contest between Labor and One Nation, if Labor's finishing first in those contests, they can heavily rely on the Green preferences, which will come to them to the tune of about 85%. But they also get about 35% of the Liberal preference vote.
Mm.
So not massive, but enough for them to win. So this is where we're talking about tactical voting. There will be in some instances where I wouldn't rule out that these voters would directly vote for Labor to stop One Nation. So that too is going to be a play, particularly amongst younger voters. We know younger voters are more alert to this tactical voting behaviour, and they will do it to stop whoever they do not like, to win. And so that's a factor. Again, Green voters, given the option of voting for a Labor candidate over a One Nation candidate, may just park their primary directly onto a Labor candidate. We will see some of that going on. I think that trend will increase because, let's be blunt, One Nation is a polarising political movement, and there are people that are absolutely opposed to them in the Liberal camp and in the Greens camp.
In the Liberal camp, I'm quite fascinated to see how this plays out. I mean, they've got agency as well, Kos. The Liberals have got a big decision to make about preferencing. Do they preference One Nation above Labor? What signal does that send to wavering One Nation voters, but also wavering Liberal voters and Labor voters? If you're in their shoes, Kos, what would you do?
It's very difficult. I think Jess Wilson's already come out and stated very clearly that they will not be preferencing One Nation. We know One Nation's handing out an open ticket in South Australia, the South Australian election. Look, for the Liberal Party in Victoria, they've got a bit of a balancing act here. There are a sizable chunk of their vote that sits in Melbourne in particular that does not like One Nation. And so Jess has to project to them a moderate Liberal brand that they can vote for. She also has to actually probably convince a portion of that One Nation vote to come back to them.
Mm.
And if that happens, then we are having a very different conversation. But that's hard because I would say the political forces that are fueling that growth for One Nation are structural. more power than protest. So that's a very difficult task for her. And so they've got significant challenges as well.
So do the South Australian Liberals, Kos. Let's do a quick South Australian check-in. We're not far away from the election at all. We're less than 2 weeks from the South Australian state election. What do the numbers tell us right now? How will One Nation fare?
We were talking about the small C Conservatives in Melbourne and what they'll do and who they'll preference. They are probably already sitting on Mallee. They've probably already jumped. And so what I think the Liberal Party's left with is its core base. Question is, does it lose more of that in the next week and a bit before Election Day, and One Nation completely sweeps them out of existence? We don't know. I'm very confident Labor's going to be returned with a significant majority. It is also the Labor brand that I think counters this global movement that we've been talking about, Nick, which is this tendency to just focus on one particular part of your constituency at the expense of another part that has historically voted for you.
Yep.
That's not a practice you see in South Australia.
No.
Right? They're very acutely aware of their broad base, and they take care of both ends, not just one.
Yes. That's been much commented on.
Yes.
The party machine, but also the leader, Peter Malinauskas, has had the capacity to appeal to burghers in the burbs, inner cities and middle suburbs as well. How bad do you think that the wipeout will be for the Liberals? Is this the first? Are we seeing the kind of entree course, Kos, into the breakdown of the old two-party model? Will we see the first example?
I think we will.
I think we will. Australia?
Yeah, I think we will. And I think there's a lot of commentators are underestimating the true organisational strength of One Nation and its emergence as a modern political force. The sort of money that's coming into them now, the infrastructure that is present. They've nominated candidates in every single state seat in South Australia. They've nominated a very good candidate in the Farrer by-election, right? They had 80 applicants.
Wow.
Right? Their rallies are into the hundreds. Something's going on. And it seems to be more than just the usual One Nation sideshow that we've been witness to over the last few decades.
And also follow the money, Kos. Follow the money. You've got Gina Reinhardt swinging behind.
Well, it isn't just Gina Reinhardt. There are many other donors as well with deep pockets. I was on the panel with Barnaby Joyce for the Australian Financial Review Business Summit, where obviously the topic of conversation was politics. But, off stage, there were people that would come up and congratulate Barnaby Joyce for his efforts. This is a business community. Now, you'd say, they're business people. No, not really. Those of us who do know the business community know that they're far more small C Conservatives than One Nation supporters. But even in that environment, you saw something going on that normally wouldn't have happened 5 years ago.
The other interesting dynamic, Kos, perhaps less pertinent for the South Australian election, is the Middle East quagmire, which we discussed last week with our brilliant guest, Kylie Gilbert-Moore. It's obviously dominating headlines globally. Key political question is, in your mind and your polling, do these sort of international conflicts actually shift domestic voting behaviour? Do they shift domestic voting behaviour at a state election vis-a-vis federal, national elections? And, we've got projections of inflation running about 5%, which is going to inflict terrible pain on ordinary working Aussies across the next 12 months. We've got panic buying at petrol outlets. Will this contribute to seeing a kind of reverse Trump bump effect? We saw, post-COVID, during the cost of living crunch, the inflation crunch, incumbents being turfed out. But then when Trump 2.0, the second Trump presidency began, we started seeing incumbents actually winning re-election in Canada, obviously Australia, as a reaction to Trump. How will incumbency play out against the backdrop? Because the conflict, even if it ends tomorrow, is going to have a seismic impact on the economy domestically and internationally.
Yeah, he's already been having, obviously, an impact on other democracies across the world, and Australia's no different. Most Australians that we speak to would tell you that they dislike the President of the United States. and you view him as an incredibly unpredictable, destabilizing personality. And really, these conflicts now, rather than in the past where it's really about, it's the right thing to do, and it's all about democracy. Most Australians' response to this now is anxiety and stress and pessimism. And most of them are concerned about the impact on the economy, on their petrol prices, on interest rates, and on inflation. And so I think the biggest difference now to what would have occurred 20 years ago if this conflict was underway is that it's no longer the old traditional beat the war drums and everyone's going to march to the tune of that war drum. Most people hate this. They hate it because of what it's going to do to their own personal lives, and it's unpredictable and it scares them.
Yeah, I think the clearest parallel conflict is really the first Gulf War.
Yeah,
early 1990s. I think Bob Hawke's decision to send really a token force to the Middle East, but that was sort of met with fairly widespread support. That ain't going to happen.
No,
on this occasion.
No, and look, and I've written about this. Keir Starmer's decision not to cooperate with Trump. People say, well, it's in response to NATO's position and the changing global order. No, it's also in response to his local politics. That by-election he lost to the Greens. The vast majority of people in their traditional constituencies do not support what's going on globally.
Yeah.
And he is very acutely aware of that. So I think we will see a lot of that going on in Australia as well. Increasing number of Australians just don't support this. And it's electorally risky and at times fatal if you embark on holding Trump's hand into whatever conflict he chooses he wants to embark on any given month.
Yeah, again, really striking. The other parallels here with the OPEC oil crisis, the oil shock from 1973 onwards, Kos.
That's right.
Obviously, originating in the Middle East, that saw incumbent after incumbent after incumbent swept from office in the mid to late 1970s, including the Whitlam Labor government here in Australia. And it would seem to me, I don't think it's a great leap of faith to or hugely gutsy projection, Kos, to see that playing out as well.
There's a caveat to that. And I think this is again, we go back to Keir Starmer. If the government of the day turns around and says, no, we do not agree with what is going on here, and because this is not only a breach of international law, but also it's going to impact on Australia's kitchen table budget,
yep,
that is a safe space to be in. But if you, as a government, are caught beating that war drum along with whoever is embarking on this conflict, punters will blame you for that inflationary shock. They will blame you for those petrol prices. So I think there's a very fine balancing act now being performed by all Western countries, Australia not excluded, that they're trying to come across as, yeah, okay, we understand why the Iranian regime needs to be dealt with, etc., but there's always a but, right? But yes, I think the book on this is yet to be completed.
There's no book for you to write, Kos. I know you're writing one. There's a second one.
There's a second one for you, mate. That's right.
Politicians, political leaders they're walking the tightrope at the moment, because it's a very fine balancing act.
Yes.
We're going to find out a lot about the dynamics there in coming weeks and months. We're also going to know a lot more about Australian politics and South Australian politics when we gather again next time in a fortnight. Kos, we'll have the results. I'm looking forward to deep diving inside to your brain and debriefing on what could be a seismic electoral result. But we've run out of time. Kos, thank you very much for your insights and wisdom this week. Thank you, Curtinistas, for tuning in. Don't forget to give us a like, to follow us across our socials. You can check us out on Apple, Spotify and YouTube. But for now, until next time, it's ciao and arrivederci.